Greetings! In the name of Odun, Odunamore, all that is good and great, all that is blessed and beautiful, all that is creative and conscious, and all that is positive and possible. May all your blessings be infinite like the night stars, and all good things be never ending. Hotep, I am Idisa Olabaya Bankole, your host to Mind Vibes, Thoughts from a Curious Mind, a bi-monthly podcast series exploring and examining social phenomena then and now. Now, in this episode of Mind Vibe, I'm going to be exploring the 70s, in which I call Exploring the 70s Movements, Their Contributions, Their Faults. Now, before we go there, though, hit that like button, share, subscribe, leave a comment. Now, I'm not going to deal with a quote in this time, because I usually always deal with a quote. All right, but I want to jump right on into this. And with this episode of Mind Vibes, I'm attempting to give my analysis on what I believe to be a vibrant but often overlooked era in the American story, which is, of course, the 70s. And again, I have entitled the piece, Exploring the 70s Movements, Their Contributions, Their Faults. Here, I will try to examine some of the movements that came about in the 70s, how they pushed the American narrative forward. But, like the Woodstock piece, I dealt with some of the fault lines of that generation. Here, I will try to examine the faults that came about with this period and why perhaps the genre of music and the fashion, and to a certain extent, many elements of the movements did not materialize in its fullness. Such movements like the feminist movement, although their causes were just and applicable, but again they were like the hippies, captured under the same paradigm and couldn't escape. That is the whiteness paradigm. The feminist movement was mainly a white woman's movement, spawning from Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique, by which Miss Friedan's whole idea was ironically based on the model wife of the 50s, which she took exception to and began in this book to critique this very idea. However, according to my good friend, Brother Danjuma Madupe, part of the women's movements, like all movements, there were variant views on how to deal with the ongoing issues of white patriarchy. Suffice it to say, this movement fractured into two different camps. But more importantly, one of the main fractures that occurred is that many of the white women movements, particularly the feminist movement, did not include African American women and were not sensitive to black women's experience and reality. But again, it is the 70s that we begin to see the voice and the power of what women can do. Unfortunately, as with many white groups that emerged in this American experiment, it too would be, to a degree, weighed down with the paradigm, again, of whiteness. Now, in our many discussions, Brother Dan Juma, who passed away long before his time, we would discuss these particular movements, not only in the 60s, but in the 70s. And one of the things that he was dealing with is the many fractures that came with the women's movements. And two of them were the white women split into what he deemed was the feminist movement, and the other was the women's rights movement. And both of them had different views on how to deal with patriarchy. The women's rights movement, according to Dan Toomer, was more about the logistical things, the same way that the civil rights movement was. They were more about, dealing with things that were by law, what we can do, dealing with, how we could deal with children after a divorce or something, right? Whereas the feminist movement was much more concerned about dealing with the people or them being human. You know? The sexual liberation became for many women, especially in America and to some degree in Europe, a reckoning of women's sexual prowess and their ability not only to be expressive with it, but be able to have the freedom to engage in it without shame or recompense. And though the history that developed with this liberation were minuscule, it did, however, open up a Pandora's box, so to speak. But more with white males who took great issues with this, and which I talked about in my feminine prowess episode of Mind Vibes, And even though many white males and many males, they were glad because, they didn't have to wear the coat, because of the birth control pills. So it also gave them a sense of freedom of having to deal with it in the raw. You know what I'm saying? But at the same time, women who were out there on the disco floor and dancing and doing all that kind of stuff, they had the ability to choose their partners and how many partners they wanted to deal with. Almost like Spike Lee's "She's Gotta Have It." Nola say, "Hey, I want to get down with the funk." And if I want to have 3 partners, okay, I can do that, because prior to the 70s or the 60s, late 60s birth control, and now with the 70s abortion, women were kind of stuck, and you had men who would be able to be the bulls in dealing with the cows in the field or something like that. Though the Black Arts Movement was a noteworthy experiment, it faltered under the weight of not being able to be firm in their position. Although both W.E.B. Du Bois of the 1920s and Maulana Granger of the 60s, who created the concept known as the Qaeda philosophy, dealt with the cultural aspect of creativity and promoting the idea that the creative expression that came out of the black artist should be primarily about, for, and by black people for the benefit of the black communities, which gave way to Antilles, the National Black Theater, the New Federation Theater, giving us wonderful works by Nikki Giovanni, Alex Kennedy, Armory Baraka, Natasha Shanghai, and others. It also gave space to the funk sound as well as the innovation in jazz. It brought us Babatunde Olatunji, master drummer from Nigeria, as well as Ray Barretta and Mongo Santeria, who were percussionists. It paved a path to many of our visual writers as well, whose works were steeped in the revisiting of the African American. But again, as my good brother Dan Juma lamented, the one thing that it did not do was to stand on its own and be black in all its fullness. Like the white youth of yesterday, their naivete came not because of their lack of education, but Tim Weiss and Dr. Robin DiAngelo hadn't come on the scene yet. Likewise here, the black artists couldn't really defend their position because Malefi Asante had not come on the scene with Afrocentricity yet. But even with this issue, this movement created some wonderful works and propelled to creative expression onto the American experience. I believe it was 1972 or 1971 that would see the first Earth Day that will go on to become an established day in April, which would be April 22nd, that deals with the environment. It will also be the period in which we had gotten the EPA, which was created by the government, or which was created that would be the government's responsibility to, in effect, be the guardians of the environment. It would bring us the phenomenal film starring the incredible Jane Fonda, The China Syndrome, dealing with the dangers of nuclear reactors, along with the film Free Willy, espousing the harm man does to other living beings that inhabit our planet. Yet, the environmental movements were also splintered into fractions. Some who were passive, yet others, like the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, waged a war on both the government and industry that he felt were destroying the environment. Again, there were a lot of, you had a lot of movements and rallies and things that were dealing with the Clean Water Act and dealing with what we were doing, at the same as we're having now, with the young lady that came out of Sweden who is dealing with this environmental thing. This is real. This was not a Humpty Booty Pie or whatever. This is real, because we only have one planet, and that's planet Earth. Again, these movements had their influence in the late 50s, throughout the 60s, but culminating in the 70s, because I believe there were factors that aided in their thrust in the 70s. Although these movements gave rise to, again, many improvements, such as Roe v. Wade for women having the right to their own bodies, the newly installed Education Department with the Carter administration, the end of the Vietnam conflict, the continuing advancement of departments at the universities dealing with other culture and gender programs. Though, as important as these were, none held more importance and had a more lasting impact than the creative expressions that came out of the disco scene. Platform shoes, large lapels, brightly colored shirts, strobe lighting, color flashing floors, and the heart-pulsing rhythms are iconic to the 70s era. And it would be this spontaneous creativity that would become the hallmark of the 70s scene. When you look at many of the films, documentaries, that's the first thing that they do it. You see that, I ain't gonna say it. I ain't even go there. But what you see is all of the paraphernalias and all of the clothing and all of the, just like in the 60s we had the black light, and you had all of the weird posters. In the 70s, you had the strobe lights, and you had the flashing lights, and you had the colors, and it was the clothing, and it was the attitude. It was the look at me, but it was let me be a king and queen on the dance floor. That was really what gives the 70s its flavor. Yet, it would also, unfortunately, be short-lived due to the times, because, times, it changes, even from the 50s, from the 60s and the 70s, the times change. And so you kind of have to change with the times. And the feverish pushback from quote-unquote mainstream America. Although 70s, with its flash, bravado, its self-imaging, and its movement and music, had its gritty side to it, it was a period that I think deserves a second look, because it was the creative expression that gave it its life. Yet, it would be that very same creativity that would become but a memory. A memory, however, in my opinion, that should be re-examined as to its music, its movement. What was its contribution to our American story, and what were its faults. Because again, it was a dynamic period. To me, there were three dynamic periods: the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And the 70s was dynamic because it was the first time that you had a creative expression that was spontaneous, that was able to bring all cultures and all people and all classes into one space. And that would be the discotheque. And be on one floor, that would be the dance floor. And gyrating and moving and expressing their uniqueness and their ability. And through some things, some things did happen. Some real nice connections happened. Now again, were there negativities? Oh, sure. You had the transmitted sexual diseases that came about. You had unfortunate, sexual assaults that were on the rise. You had crime that was really, devastating communities, particularly that of the black communities, with the drugs being pushed into the black communities. But the funk, the rhythms, the sound, the lyrics, the ability to reinvent oneself, to be a star for the night, that is what we remember when we look at the 70s. Yes, we deal with, like I said, the movements of the 70s. Women's movements and the black arts movements and other things. And the innovations that came into many of the creative expressions, like the theaters and the visual arts. But it was the flash, the bravado, the power, and the kind of freedom that the 70s exhibited that became what the 70s was about. And to narrow it down, it was about optimism. It was about joy. And it was about the sexual expression of both men and women. So I think I think it's worthwhile to go back and look at the 70s to see, like the 60s, to re-examine it, to see what we can learn from it, what happened, why, and are there any things that we can take from it so that we can today begin to see a more fruitful application of those things. But in the meantime, may we all strive to bend the arc of justice towards humanity and believe that love and peace can be achieved. This is Olobai Bankole saying, Madasi Peace.